moderator for tonight's presentation from Uncommon Sense, the group of professional and amateur scholars that study interesting things and then like to share it with the parish and beyond. The January presentation, as you can see on the screen, is on Genesis and creation. Domination or radical stewardship. Our presenter tonight is Sheldon Greaves. He has a PhD in ancient and Near East studies with an emphasis on the Hebrew Bible from the University of California, Berkeley. He's also one of two scholars in residence at the Church of the Good Samaritan, one of the founding members of the predecessor group to our currently Uncommon Scholars or Uncommon Sense group. Our previous name was Guerrilla Scholars. I think Uncommon Sense is a good transition. And he's going to be presenting tonight for about an hour, I think, and we'd like to take questions at the end if possible. And I'll be monitoring the chat if you want to ask questions in the chat, and then I'll moderate it at the end as well. And I'll just put one plug in. Sheldon has an outstanding podcast called Understanding the Old Testament, and I have listened to it in its entirety twice, and certain podcasts more than twice. And I'm sure we'll be able to get some directions on how to listen. It is truly amazing, entertaining, and I think very, very eye-opening. So I think with that, Sheldon, why don't you go ahead and get started?
Okay. Let's see. It sounds like someone else was open. Okay.
I think everybody's muted now, and I also will.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you, Craig, for that introduction. I really appreciate it. I want to talk first a little bit about the environmental movement, which has an interesting history, which ironically many in the movement are reluctant to talk about. For much of its recent history, environmentalism was seen as a field of activism dependent mainly on scientific findings and concerned with scientific problems. In addition, modern science and technology were also receiving much of the blame for environmental degradation starting in the 1960s, so this kind of makes sense. The irony, however, is that a large part of the environmental movement had its roots in early American Protestantism, Calvinism, Puritanism, and other Christian traditions. And some of the movement's forebears, such as John Muir or Henry David Thoreau, came out of these traditions. And even today, one finds religious metaphors throughout environmental discourse. In fact, there are some scholars, one in particular by the name of Robert Nelson, who has argued rather persuasively that environmentalism constitutes a religion on its all its own. Now, many environmentalists, of course, beg to differ. Some do not like the idea of being lumped together with Christians, which for them usually means evangelical or fundamentalist Christians, who are not known for their sympathy to science. Others are understandably wary of being associated with what's called dominion theology, which is a fringe Christian doctrine that argues that human exploitation of the earth is literally a God-given right. Former EPA Director Scott Pruitt is a good recent example, although such views as his are not reflected among most academic theologians and Bible scholars. So, see if we can advance this. There we go. Another important reason why, is because of the classic essay by Lynn White Jr., The Historical Roots of Our Ecologic Crisis. This article appeared in Science magazine in 1967, and it laid the blame for the environmental crisis squarely on the head of the Judeo-Christian tradition, and even went so far as to advocate a schism between environmentalists and Christianity. This paper, which frankly is replete with historical errors and misrepresentations, nevertheless had a number of consequences. It prompted some soul searching on the part of some Christian sects that led to a greater involvement in environmental causes. Others abandoned Christianity in favor of what they considered to be more earth-friendly faith communities. Some conservative denominations accepted White's idea that Genesis preached divinely sanctioned ecological exploitation. Moreover, while many of the problems with the paper are well known among religious scholars, it's still considered the last word on the subject among much, if not most, of the scientific community. But the most serious outcome was, on the whole, that voices from the Judeo-Christian community were basically dismissed and largely shut out of the environmental conversation. In a related development, the environmental crisis was and still is seen as a matter of science to be addressed largely with technical fixes. However, there's a growing realization in that the environmental crisis is in fact a moral as much as a scientific problem, and solutions will require a shift in morals. This creates difficulties for the empirically minded. Morals are not really measurable, they're subjective, usually grasped intuitively when used commonly. It's almost unscientific. And yet, the moral argument that, just for example, the Earth's ecosystems have value in and of themselves is one of the strongest arguments available to restore and preserve our endangered ecosystems. Well, this brings us to Genesis. What is Genesis? It is the locus classicus for the Judeo-Christian ideals on the earth and human responsibility towards it. It is the beginning, but by no means the end. What we find in Genesis informs much of the legislation that follows in the first 5 books of the Hebrew Scriptures, the Torah. The subject continues through biblical and apocryphal literature and into this seemingly endless sea of rabbinic and theological writings down to the present day. However, Genesis is also hobbled by a role that has been frankly thrust upon it, which is as an explanation for the literal creation of the cosmos. Because it was about the only ancient text known to the West that dealt with that question, it has been forced to do double duty as a physics or cosmology text. Happily, we now have modern geology and allied sciences, but Genesis remains stuck playing a part that is both inappropriate and obscures deeper, more important matters. So if you want to have a meaningful discussion of what Genesis is about, please abandon any and all attempts to connect Genesis with the actual origins of the cosmos, evolutions, and so on. Just let it go and never, ever read Genesis as science ever again, worlds without end. It's long past time that we unshackle the text from that burden. Before we start looking at Genesis, it's important to understand the function of creation stories in the ancient Near East. Simply put, creation accounts, or cosmogonies, as scholars call them, were social and political statements, almost like a national charter. Cosmogonies were a framework within which a people would articulate basic values and define fundamental institutions. Figuratively tying these values and institutions to the founding of the cosmos implied that they were set in stone, so to speak, by their divinity or divinities. They carried the divine seal of approval from the foundations of the world. Reciting or ritually enacting cosmogonies usually formed part of a nation's celebration of its new year. It was a way for a nation to ritually recreate itself and the cosmos around it, reaffirming the way things were done, namely the kingship and everything associated with that. This was true in Babylon during the annual Akitu festival, which included a public recitation of their epic of creation called the Enuma Elish. The typical cosmogonic tale in Mesopotamia and Canaanite Syro-Palestine usually involved some form of cosmic battle against the personified forces of chaos. Once chaos had been defeated or subdued and the cosmos set in order, the creator god sets up and lays out the primary institutions that will define his reign. It's at this point that we can ascertain the values and priorities that drive that cosmogony society. Okay, so let's talk about Judaism in exile, because this is where we find Genesis taking its final form. With this background, we can turn to Genesis and look at its key values and institutions. The setting of Genesis, the place where it received its final editorial shape, was the Babylonian exile, which was a 50-year period between 586 BCE and 536, when the Jews lived in Babylon. This was after the destruction of Jerusalem and its temple by Nebuchadnezzar. Genesis comprises, among other things, a rebuttal to the Babylonian worldview. But consider the circumstances. Jerusalem, the holy city, and its temple are in ruins. The Davidic dynasty is no more. The Jews are removed from their land and live in a society in which the Babylonian worldview is victorious and dominant. For a Jewish redactor to edit together a cosmogony by which the Jews effectively announce themselves as a nation while in exile, if nothing else, was an act of unmitigated chutzpah. But it also proved to be foresighted, because after Babylon fell to the Persians in 336 BCE, 536 BCE, the Emperor Cyrus the Great allowed all of the exiles in Babylon to return to their homelands. Now, Genesis suddenly becomes, for lack of a better word, practical. Suddenly, they can become a nation again, only, as we've seen, without the usual institutions of the ancient state. They just don't have a king, they don't have an army, none of that stuff. So to put it another way, the Jews have to rebuild their state from a place of weakness and vulnerability. It required an approach that was completely different from the conventions of surrounding nations. To better understand the radical nature of Genesis, let's first summarize Babylon's creation epic and its worldview, in other words, the competition. The Enuma Elish begins with old gods of chaos who give birth to a set of younger, more vigorous gods. A rift develops between the two groups, with the old gods threatening to destroy their younger offspring. One of these gods, Marduk, offers to lead an effort to overthrow the old order, but only in exchange for absolute power should he succeed. The other gods agree, and eventually the two sides meet in battle. Marduk fights and slays the chaos god Tiamat in single combat. He uses her corpse to create the cosmos. With the cosmos completed, now we get to the important part. Marduk sets up key institutions. He constructs a palace and makes clear that his rule is absolute, backed up by alliances and uncontested political power, and most importantly, systemic violence. Finally, almost as an afterthought, the gods create humans out of a mixture of clay and the blood of a rebellious god that was executed after the battle. The purpose of humans, according to the Babylonian literature, is to do the dirty work of maintaining the canals and the rough agricultural work that the gods didn't want to bother with. And now with the mechanism, but with mechanisms such as plague and natural disaster to keep the human population from getting out of control. So to summarize, here's the worldview of Israel's captors. Creation is enabled via combat and destruction. The created order is held in place by kingship, centered in a palace, wielding absolute power and enforced by systemic violence. Humans are basically worker drones, and they are very expendable. And there are the key institutions are the palace, kingship, and measures to keep them in check. Okay, well and good. Now, let's look at Genesis. Starting in Genesis 1, God is simply there. We don't have a theogony or birth of the gods. Creation is by word. No wrestling with other gods, no combat, just words spoken and everything obeys. It is, we might say, a very nonviolent creation. Given that cosmogonies reflect how a nation is to be established and governed, and considering that the Jews did not have access to armies or kingship or the other institutions of nationhood, this makes sense. We also need to remember that there are actually two creation stories in Genesis. The first runs from chapter 1, verse 1 through chapter 2, verse 4. This is the 6 days of creation, and we find two key institutions set up after the creation of the cosmos. The first of these is humanity, male and female. Humans are not an afterthought, as they are in the Babylonian sources. God creates humans in the divine image, but the passage uses a special verb, bara, which signifies a special divine creative act. And just to drive the point home, they repeat that verb 3 times in this key passage in verse 27. Each time the verb appears in the Hebrew Bible, God is the subject of the verb. In other words, only God can bara. The second institution is the Sabbath. Christians often miss this bit, especially if they're fixated on Genesis as science. But for Jewish interpreters, this is actually the climax of the first cosmology. Consider this from, for lack of a better word, an environmental perspective. God commands everyone to take a day off once a week. And make no mistake, this is a commandment. When we come to the Decalogue in Exodus, the commandment to keep the Sabbath is the longest of the commandments, specifying that everyone, including servants and animals, get the day off. This is a truly remarkable innovation that incorporates the need to rest into the very fabric of the cosmos. Life needs rest to revive, to heal, to regenerate. For humanity, I might add, it's also an opportunity to think, wonder, and reflect. Now, before we go much further, I want to go over some concepts that are crucial to understanding what it is that creation is trying to accomplish. The short version is that cosmos supplants chaos. Well, both of these concepts concern life. The basic idea of chaos, at least in the biblical texts, is one of lifelessness. Where chaos reigns, nothing can live, nothing grows. When Genesis speaks of the earth being tohu abohu in Hebrew, or without form and void in the King James Version, the term otherwise refers to desert or wilderness. Primordial chaos tends to be dark, wet, and undifferentiated. It is disorganized, inert matter. If you want a good intuitive feel for chaos, Go find and contemplate a large, paved, empty parking lot on a very dark night in the pouring rain. Chaos is anti-life. Cosmos is its polar opposite. Where cosmos is established, life emerges. The stronger the cosmic essence, the more fertile and abundant is the life that thrives there. Cosmos, I should also mention, also requires maintenance. Otherwise, it can be supplanted by chaos. What's interesting in Genesis, at least in chapter 1, is that after God separates the elements of the universe into their proper context, life just kind of emerges of itself. Let the earth bring forth, is how Genesis describes it. Keep these definitions of cosmos and chaos in mind because they'll become important later on. The second creation story begins in chapter 2, verse 4. Now, from there, although the cosmogony itself is extremely brief, it does take us to the third major institution in the cosmogonic literature of Genesis. You will recall that upon finishing the Babylonian cosmos, Marduk builds a palace to consolidate his rule. But upon completing the cosmos in Genesis, God plants a garden. I believe this contrast is deeply significant. Take a moment and consider how a society governed in the manner of a garden might look. Speaking as one who assists my spouse, who is a much better gardener than I am, our success is mostly due to creating the right conditions for the seeds we plant. Sometimes one must weed out undesirable plants, but sometimes a tomato or other plant will pop up out of place, in which case we let it grow and help it along as best we can. I also find that putting out bird seed attracts birds who also dine on weed seeds, although sometimes they will dig up sprouted vegetable seeds. The point here is that the best gardeners don't succeed through the application of brute force. Consider also that when God specifies resources that are available to humanity, they are only allowed fruits and nuts, things that you can gather. In other words, they couldn't even kill plants. Animals, too, were off the menu. This also becomes important later on. So it's at this point that we can talk about what I suppose might be considered a fourth institution, which is the human dominion over creation. This is the famous verse in Genesis 1, verse 28. And God blessed them and said unto them, be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth and subdue it and have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the fowl of the air, and over every living thing that moveth upon the earth. Now, we hear about this a lot, usually as an indictment of the Judeo-Christian traditions due to Lynn White, Jr.'s aforementioned article, and other statements to the effect that God made the earth for humans to consume however they wish. But a close examination of the text reveals something rather different. Let's try to unpack some of it. Much of this comes down to translation issues. Multiply and replenish. A better rendering of this part would be fertile, increase, fill the earth, and master it. This is often misconstrued as a commandment to multiply, except that it's couched explicitly as a blessing, not a commandment. In fact, each instance of the phrase be fertile, increase, etc. in Genesis is phrased as a blessing, never a commandment. This is because of God's exclusive control over life in the Hebrew Bible, but we'll get to that later as well. We also need to address this word translated as subdue, as in subdue the earth. I prefer to render this as master, as in to exercise competent control over something, the way a musician might master the piano. This is much more consistent with the idea of humanity as a gardener or steward of creation. Now, recall that in Genesis chapter 1, God creates humanity in the divine image. The language of the text emphasizes the divine nature of humans and the divine quality of their creation. It lays the groundwork for a crucial concept, and here it is. Because humans are in the image of God the Creator, their role is to do the kinds of work that God the Creator does, which is to advance life by replacing chaos with cosmos. Genesis defines human dominion in chapter 2, where God creates the animals from the dust and then brings them before Adam, who gives them their names. The act of naming something or someone in the ancient Near East was fraught with significance. To know the true name of someone or something, even a god, was to have power over it. To name someone or to give someone a new name was to assume both power over them and to take on responsibility for their welfare. But perhaps more important in this context, to name someone or to name something was to participate in its creation. Just as God names the different zones of cosmos once they've been teased apart as an act of creation, so Adam's naming of the animals makes him a co-creator with God. This helps explain why, when God establishes humanity's dominion, that dominion only refers to animals. Often one hears the claim that God gave humans dominion over the earth, but this is incorrect. We also need to dig a little deeper into this dominion business, because a superficial reading suggests that it equates to exploitation. This is a classic example of what is sometimes called the dictionary fallacy, in which one takes a word and interprets it according to the basic dictionary meaning without regard for the larger context. The word used in the Hebrew text does, in fact, usually appear in a context of domination and the exercise of force. But in our context here, force and exploitation are pretty much ruled out. Consider humans are not to consume animals in any way. They are created, the created order enjoins both humans and animals to be fruitful and multiply. And as co-creators, humans are responsible for enhancing and expanding the created order. Um, One can find several ways to describe this relationship, but exploitive isn't one of them. We can learn more by looking more closely at what the ancients considered to be competent dominion. When kings wanted to boast about their competence as rulers, they would frequently boast to how the land was fertile and prospered because of their wise rule and stewardship. Another avenue is to look more closely at how the word itself was regarded by Jewish interpreters. One rather clever ancient comment makes the note that because makes note of the fact that in an unvocalized Hebrew text, the word for to have dominion could also be read, they shall descend, as in this midrash from the Genesis Rabbah, written in the 4th century CE. Rabbi Hanina says, if he merits it, God says, Urudu, have dominion. While if he does not merit it, God says, Yurdu, let them descend. And then Rabbi Jacob of Kfar Hanan also makes the same point. Of him who is in our likeness, I say, Urudu, have dominion. But of him who is not in our likeness and image, I say, Yurdu, let them descend. I confess I rather like this interpretation because it reflects a larger understanding throughout the ancient Near East that nature and human activity are closely linked. Misbehavior by humans will provoke a negative reaction from creation. And I mean, that's probably more true today than it has ever been, quite frankly. So when God puts Adam in the garden, the text says that his job is to tend and keep it. The word I've translated as tend has the basic meaning of to work, but it can also mean to cultivate. The King James translates this as to dress, which in 1611, when the KJV was published, it meant to set in order, which frankly also works. The verb to keep has a basic meaning of watch, guard, or even protect. It doesn't make a lot of sense here because it's not clear why the garden needs guarding, let alone protecting. But it begins to become clearer when we see that this word is also used of keeping the Sabbath. It's also employed for guarding a sacred precinct like the temple from ritual contamination. Both the Sabbath and the temple were subject to violation and desecration. Keeping the Sabbath and guarding the sanctuary were divine commandments. They were not optional. Now, this is speculation on my part, but I like to think that Adam and Eve are to protect the garden against the re-emergence of chaos. Now, at this point, keeping the garden was not difficult. Humans could freely eat of many different trees. Adam and Eve are living a semblance of the hunter-gatherer economy, only without the hunter part. And later, after the fall, things get harder and their mode of existence starts looking more like traditional agriculture, and it requires a lot more work. But their mandate to extend and maintain a state of cosmos in the earth is never rescinded. Now, Noah and the ark are probably the signature example of humanity's dominion in action. However, prior to that point, humans turned out to be carnivorous and homicidal, which eventually led to an unsustainable world filled with violence, as the text reads. So recognizing this, after the flood, God makes a new covenant with Noah that includes some concessions. Humans are still forbidden from killing each other, but they may kill and eat animals provided they drain the blood believed to contain the life of the animal into the ground, thus returning the life back to God. Throughout the Torah, God is clearly the one in charge of life, however one chooses to define it. Life is his domain, and humankind may not intrude upon it. In fact, under this new arrangement, consuming an animal without draining the lifeblood is the same as murder. This is stated explicitly in the prohibition against consuming blood found in Leviticus chapter 17. The phrasing of those laws portrays serious anxiety about the consequences. Not only does it specify that consuming blood is equal to murder, it states that the guilty party will be cut off. This is the karet penalty, which implies a crime against God, usually punishable by God, and generally assumed to result in the eventual extinction of the guilty party's family line. So this is really serious stuff. The commandment prohibiting the consumption of animal blood meant that eating animals was a risky business. It had to be done just right. It's now understood that this is the root of the Jewish dietary laws. In order to reduce the risk of incurring the karet penalty for consumption of blood, ancient Jewish legislators came up with an arbitrary list of rules designed to reduce the taking of animal life to an acceptable minimum. Additionally, Jewish laws regarding the slaughtering of animals for food place a premium on reducing the pain and suffering of animals as much as possible. If the process is not carried out exactly right, is such that the animal in any way suffers unnecessarily, the meat is not considered kosher. There's also a strong current of rabbinic opinion that the Jewish dietary laws are in fact a gentle path to vegetarianism. When one adopts a vegetarian diet, suddenly keeping a kosher household becomes much, much easier, which maybe perhaps was the point. Now let's summarize the primary points and institutions for ancient Israel the way we did with Babylon. So creation is nonviolent. It's primarily based on the primacy of life over lifelessness. The Sabbath is a day of rest ordained and practiced by God. The garden, as opposed to the palace, as a fundamental governing institution, or at least a central institution. Humanity created in the image of the Creator and tasked with to continue the process of creation. And dominion, humans are co-creators with God, and therefore they're responsible for the welfare of the animal world. Now, I want to examine some passages in Scripture and Old Testament in particular that promote kindness and mercy toward the animal world. We've already mentioned that animals are to rest on the Sabbath, but it goes further than that. Deuteronomy 22 states that if you see a domestic animal wandering astray, you take it back to its owner. If you don't know who the owner is, you take it home and care for it until its owner comes looking for it. If you see a fallen donkey or ox by the wayside, you help it back to its feet. Exodus has a different version of this commandment, which is kind of interesting. It specifies that one does this even for the animal of one's enemy. This should also put us in mind of the words of Jesus in Luke 14:5. Which of you having a son or an ox that has fallen into a well will not immediately pull him out on the Sabbath? Note that this statement is a rhetorical question. The answer was assumed to be obviously in the affirmative. In fact, you could probably translate it as, you know, who but an idiot having a son or an ox fallen into a well will not immediately pull him out on the Sabbath. So note also that Jesus puts animals on the same footing as humans or even family members. Both are equally deserving of aid, even on the Sabbath. An ox that is treading out the grain as part of the threshing process is not muzzled, so it can snack on the grain if it's hungry. The Bible enjoins yoking two different kinds of animals together, as this can be hard and weaker on the weaker of the two. Proverbs chapter 10 posits the regard for animal welfare as a mark of righteousness, and cruelty to animals as a sign of wickedness. It also states that a wise man knows the condition of his flocks and herds. We also, I don't have it here on the slide, but we also read in the book of Jonah when that God spared the city of Nineveh, not merely because the people there repented, but also because many cattle lived there. In Hosea, we find a remarkable verse to the effect that in a future idealized world, God will do away with the hunting of animals. And I will make for them a covenant on that day with the beasts of the field, the birds of the heaven, and the creeping things of the ground, and I will abolish the bow, the sword, and war from the land, and I will make you lie down in safety. I find it interesting here that Hosea just seems to casually assume that animals are capable of entering into a covenant relationship with God. I find that rather interesting in and of itself. Psalm 36 verse 6 even suggests that humans and animals are both subject to God's salvation, which has some pretty interesting implications from a theological perspective. And then there's the pseudepigraphic work of Second Enoch, also known as the Secrets of Enoch, which even suggests that animals will one day testify in judgment against those humans who abused them. We could say more, much more, but about how the Bible describes a proper relationship between humans and animals. But there's one more subject I want to touch on before we go to questions. and that is the regard for the land. Um, while the Old Testament is a pretty clear, makes it pretty clear that the earth itself belongs to God, there are a number of commandments calling for proper treatment of the land. While it's not specified in the Decalogue, farmland was allowed a sabbatical rest every 7 years. It was allowed to lay fallow. When the Israelites entered the Promised Land, one of their first tasks was to plant more trees and allow them to mature before enjoying their fruits. The Bible even commands respect for an enemy's trees. The Israelites were forbidden from cutting down fruit trees when waging war. When you besiege a city for a long time, making war against it in order to take it, you shall not destroy its trees by wielding an axe against them. You may eat from them, but you shall not cut them down. Are the trees in the field human, that they should be besieged by you? Then compare this with Jeremiah's lament of the environmental destruction and waste that accompanies the fall of Jerusalem. This is, I will take up weeping and wailing for the mountains and a lamentation for the pastures of the wilderness, because they are laid waste so that no one passes through, and the lowing of cattle is not heard. Both the birds of the air and the beasts have fled and gone. And just as a side note, this kind of reminds me of a passage in a recently discovered fragment of the Babylonian Gilgamesh epic, in which Gilgamesh and his buddy Enkidu have just been victorious in battle over the forest god Humbaba, which involved basically cutting down all the forests because Gilgamesh's temple needs nice cedar beams to be constructed. And as they're starting back, Enkidu looks over the devastation and he basically says, "My friend, what have we done? We've turned this forest into a wasteland. How are we going to answer for this before the gods?" Or words to that effect. So it kind of suggests that maybe the author of Gilgamesh understood something of environmental degradation and what it could mean for the people back then. So how literally are we to take all of this? As I mentioned, these stories are best understood as models that describe situations, interactions, personality types, and how they relate to each other. They allow us to explore how the texts might have been understood anciently. That said, the crises that we face today are not metaphorical or theoretical, they're real. And while technical fixes will be part of whatever solutions we employ, they're not going to be enough. In fact, we can make a pretty good case that technology helped get us into this mess. We have to change the way we think about the world and the creatures that inhabit it, to frame our role as a calling and an expression of who and what we are, and to promote life abundant over death whenever and wherever we can. There are several points that I can see coming out of this. According to Genesis, humans have a divine calling, a mandate to care for the earth. It's our job. This responsibility is literally part of who we are. According to Genesis, our primary concern is care of the animal world, which encompasses enabling their mandate to be fruitful and multiply. In other words, we are to care for animals, but the field of action is the whole earth. This is to be accomplished partly by acts of kindness towards animals, but also by improving and expanding zones in which living things can fill the earth. Calling ourselves stewards doesn't really capture, in my view, the scope and urgency of humanity's charter. It doesn't fully encompass the idea that as beings created in the image of a God who creates, our job is to continue that process. God may have completed the heavens and the earth, but the process of creation is ongoing. A society that values both animal life and human life is more likely to be just and humane. And I think this is one of the key insights of the ancient Hebrew legislators as they went and developed the rest of the Torah and the commandments and regulations therein. And finally, the health of the animal world is a measure of our effectiveness as stewards, co-creators of creation. So I haven't attempted to explore many of the implications of creating animal-friendly spaces, the question of vegetarianism, loss and restoration of natural habitat, population balance, and plenty of other issues that come tumbling out of humanity's dominion as articulated in Genesis. They're all important and worthy of exploring in and of themselves, but I think it is more important and perhaps even more provocative to consider internalizing the biblical teaching that it is our nature to care for living things, that making the world less toxic, less hostile to life is to realize and exercise our divine nature. But by the same token, when we allow the destruction or degradation of the natural world, we literally invoke chaos. Genesis expressly defines human dominion as the realm of living things, but by implication, where life ceases, that dominion ends. Genesis presents the mandate to care for animals as literally foundational to the cosmos. It should prompt us to reimagine a different relationship with the earth as a whole and realizing a more truly human and humane morality as we do so. Thank you very much. And to Craig's point, if you're interested in my podcast, here's where you can find it. It has a website, lofcoastpress.com. You can find a link to it there. Also, it's available on Stitcher and a number of other venues where one can find podcast distribution sites. So, Craig, I guess.
Yes, thank you, Sheldon. That was wonderful. And I've heard some of that in the podcast. So there's even more there. So please go find the podcast and whatever podcast host you use. What I'd like to do, just because I can't see everybody's raising their hand, and I don't want people to talk over each other, if at least initially here, I can get you to put your question into the chat, then I can pose them to Sheldon in the order that I receive them. So while you're thinking of your question and maybe typing it up, Sheldon, I've got a couple of questions. So back in probably 1991 in my religion and human ecology class, I had to read the Lynn White Jr. paper. And I think with good reason, I haven't reread it since then. So could you maybe talk about a few of the other problems that are with that paper, and maybe for people kind of go a little bit beyond just, that it blamed the Judeo-Christian tradition for the ills of the world? Oh, I think you're muted, Sheldon.
Oh, there we go.
There
is that better? Yeah, sorry. Well, first of all, from a scholarly standpoint, the paper has some serious problems. If you go to check the footnotes, you'll discover that there aren't any. He doesn't list a single source for any of the assertions that he makes. He doesn't even mention anything in the in the text itself. He doesn't make reference to any secondary literature or anything like that. Any references to scripture itself are paraphrased. There are no citations given, and many of the citations are taken out of context or just flat out wrong. So there's that problem. But the biggest problem is that he makes this claim that the idea of exploitation is central to Christianity and to the Judeo-Christian religion. But he also never really talks about any, he doesn't mention any um, theologians or philosophers or popes or rabbis or whatever who actually make this claim. And there's a good reason for it. There aren't any. Now, at least not up until, fairly recently, you do start seeing that kind of rhetoric that, the earth is ours to exploit. I mean, I made reference to Scott Pruitt, but the interesting thing is that you don't see this rhetoric appearing until after the start of the Industrial Revolution. And even then, the people who are making those claims are not churchmen. They're not clergy. They're not theologians. They're apologists for the industrial people. Now, gradually, there was a kind of making of common cause between what I guess we could call big business and certain conservative Christian sects who were, trying to stay relevant in a changing world, and they kind of glommed onto each other and kind of exchanged some of their ideological DNA, and so that's why you get that sort of thing, that you see that today. But historically, yeah, it just isn't there. Another problem with White is that he paints this very rosy picture of this world of pagan worshipers who were all about nature and all about respecting nature, and that they wouldn't do the sorts of things that that we are doing to the earth. They wouldn't, strip it bare and everything. Unfortunately, yeah, they totally would, and they did. That's why we don't, why the cedars of Lebanon, have now basically been reduced to something roughly the size of a good, rest stop. In fact, there are some boundary markers that were set up. There was an attempt to do this. I think it was Hadrian. He set up some boundary stones at what was then the border of the cedars of Lebanon, and said, "Don't cut any more trees. We're trying to conserve this." But of course, they went and cut them anyway. So, you know, the the pagan tradition really doesn't have much to brag about either. I mean, they were perfectly willing to exploit the world as they saw fit. I don't I guess that answers most of your question, right?
Yeah, I think
Okay.
so.
Okay, cool.
Let me pose the first question in the chat to you then. How can we begin this a new way of or recapture this original way of understanding our relationship to the creation in view of our supercharged technical world today?
Excellent question. This is going to come as kind of a shock to a lot of people, but there is a new emerging history of humanity, or more specifically, a prehistory of humanity that has makes some very interesting suggestions about the human ability to change the way they do things. I just finished this book. It's called The Dawn of Everything, and it's by anthropologist David Graeber and archaeologist David Wengrow. And it is a fabulous book. It takes the archaeological findings of the last 30 years and consolidates it. And one of the findings that they discovered was that ancient humans or prehistoric humans seemed to have this remarkable ability to just kind of say, yeah, we're not going to do this anymore, and just pivot and do something completely different, change the way they lived in in very radical ways. And they give a number of examples of this. And it wasn't just small villages either. We're talking about large complexes, sort of early proto-cities that had literally tens of thousands of inhabitants. And they seem to have this ability to just be able to walk away from something like that wasn't working for them. And this is one of the points that Graeber in particular makes. I really like David Graeber's material. Unfortunately, he passed away much too young and somewhat unexpectedly in 2020. Um, but he makes the point that one of the things that we seem to have lost as a civilization is the ability to say no, or the ability to walk away, or as he puts it, the ability to disobey what would normally be considered, the standard way of doing things. I don't think he meant that in terms of the law, although, I imagine he was also instrumental in in organizing the Occupy Wall Street protests. So he kind of has a, I guess, skirting the law kind of goes with the territory, but the ability to just, when you've got convention shouting at you that this is the way you do things, and to be able to say, no, not going to do that. We seem to have lost that ability, and maybe that's something we need to work on.
And maybe we should applaud and reward Volvo for saying we're going to be making exclusively electric cars, and most recently Ford moving to that platform in the next 20 years, I think. I mean,
I believe so, yeah.
Sometimes the business conscience actually is moving in the right direction ahead of the mandates from government or the demands of consumers even. Let me, if it's okay, let me move on to
sure.
Another question. I'm going to have a follow-up question to this one because it's something I've just recently read about the Levant, the region of the Middle East, the Eastern Middle East, or Eastern Mediterranean. So this question starts with a bit of a statement. The distinction between agriculture and animal hunting was new to me. We know hunting is key in the ancestry of Europe, Africa, and the steppes. What was the core food source for early Middle Eastern people, given their environmental scarcity of wild animals?
Okay. Something that's important to remember is that the Middle East, as we see it today, is not the Middle East as it was back then.
Yeah.
The area in modern day Iraq, which today is kind of a howling desert, it used to be called the Fertile Crescent, and it was called that for a reason. But one of the reasons why it's no longer that way is partly because over irrigation increased the salinity in the soil, which made farming more difficult. But also in the 13th century, during the Mongol invasion, after the sack of Baghdad, they basically went through and they completely destroyed these irrigation systems that had been in place for thousands of years. And the land has never recovered from that. Also, you had environmental ravages such as the Assyrians. You read in the Bible about lions. David is compared to a lion, and lion this and lion that. Well, lions are extinct in the Middle East, and the main reason for that is that they were hunted out to extinction. The Assyrian kings would go on these lion hunting expeditions, and there are these bas-reliefs from some of the Assyrian royal chambers, where they show these lions, dead lions, stacked up like cordwood, just by the hundreds, and that's going to create a problem as well. So in fact, one of the reasons why the Assyrian Empire eventually weakened and collapsed, it is believed, is this sport of lion hunting killed off all the lions in the area of the Assyrian heartland. And this caused the small mammal population to explode. Well, when the small mammal population explodes, it completely devastates the pasturage and grazing land. And this in turn reduced the Assyrian ability to field any cavalry, which was very important for their military venture, their chariots, and also, regular horse cavalry. So that made it even harder for them to keep a hold on the more distant parts of their empire. And eventually, this, among other things, was one of the things that weakened them. So back then, yeah, there was more to eat. There was more stuff there. If you go to Israel, you'll find, it's like, you can't swing a dead goat without hitting the remains of an ancient wine press or something like that. They loved their wine. So the fertility of the land was actually pretty remarkable. It really was a land of milk and honey. So
well, that was, if I can add on to that comment,
Uh-huh.
that was the revelation in my recent reading of the last couple of days, that when
Mhm.
Moses sent the scouts out
Uh-huh.
and they came back and reported that it was a land flowing with milk and honey, those are renewable resources.
Yes, that's true.
Those are renewable resources, which is very different than the other foods that we might consume.
Mhm.
These could, if you create the right environment, the bees will give you
Mhm.
honey as
Mhm.
long as
Mhm.
there's flowers to pollinate.
Yeah.
And then the other revelation was that that this region, we can't really reflect back today's imagery onto antiquity, because it was heavily forested and it was
Mhm.
verdant and it was the Fertile Crescent and it was highly productive. And in my brief 1 year as an ag engineer before I became a mechanical engineer, we in my irrigation class, we marveled at the irrigation prowess of Israelis today. They
Mhm.
make a lot of it. I'm glad to hear that that's a long-standing tradition there.
Yeah, it is. Well, and you have the similar thing in Egypt. Where there's water, there's life. And in fact, there are places in Egypt where you can, where you get to the edge of where you can bring the water. You can literally stand with one foot in fertile soil and the other foot in dry, lifeless desert sand. The distinction is that sharp. But so yeah, it all comes down to water.
Let me,
Mhm.
if we've got time,
Yeah.
let me ask you a couple more questions that are in the chat. Can you expand upon what is meant by the primary teaching that man is made in the image of God?
Hmm.
What is the image of God as understood in Genesis?
Hmm.
Is the text talking about a physical, metaphysical, or spiritual being or energy? And that's the
Oh
question.
boy. Yeah.
And
Um,
in 5 minutes or less.
yes, of course. So here I am about to commit the sin of theology, but no matter. Um, in this part of the Bible, God is unambiguously anthropomorphic. He before the fall, he goes down, he hangs out in the garden with Adam. Hey Adam, how you doing? Hey Elohim, how's it going? It's like they're neighbors almost. And so if you want to say that they're in the image of God that way, um, yeah, I suppose you could do that. But I think in this point, in this instance, the idea of God's image is more in terms of function. What is God doing? If you're going to be in the image of God, well, that's, it's not enough just to look a certain way. God is not a look. God is a function. God is a field of action, a dynamic that is part of everything that's working through the world. And I think that's, the other part is important too. I like the idea, frankly. I grew up with the idea of an anthropomorphic God, and it made God a whole lot easier to relate to. But this idea of function is also very important. Who we are and what we do reflects the manner of our origin in that sense. I don't know. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah. We're at 8:06, and so maybe I'll say this is the last question, and
Okay.
I think it's a good one because it's kind of a go in peace, serve the Lord sort of question. What can today's Christians and Jews do to call attention to the moral dimension of environmental protection?
That is an excellent question, because we are very resistant to those, or at least the discussion today is resistant to those kinds of questions. I think what we need to do is we need to ask those questions, and we need to demand answers. We need to demand that there be a moral accounting. And if someone, is going to say, well, we have to reduce this to dollars and cents. No, you cut that right off. One of the problems, well, there's a concept that I've recently become aware of. I think it's called existence value or something like that. An idea or a way of measuring the, I don't want to say measuring, but designating the value of something like, say, I don't know, an old growth rainforest, in terms of its value. Simply, it's because of what it is, we should leave it alone. It has value in and of itself, and that value really can't be measured. And we can't allow that to ever become quantified, because the minute you say, well, yeah, well, how much is that? How valuable is that? The minute you hang a number on it, you've hung a price on it. And the minute you hang a price on it, someone's going to try to figure out how to make money off of it, and that thing is doomed. So we need to insist on a larger moral picture, that some things are worth saving simply because of what they are, and because of what they mean, both aesthetically and spiritually and physically, to the rest of the world.
Thanks be to God.
Okay.
Well, I think it's 8:08. Let's kind of honor the time commitment. Thank you all for spending your evening. Sheldon, thank you. Wonderful as always. And if anyone hasn't enjoyed the podcast, this is what you get in the podcast. It's wonderful. It's really wonderful. So I think we are. Oh, thank you. We're on next month, mid-month, similar time.